Oh, wow. Hey, pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in once again. Appreciate you guys making the time to be here. Uh, Today, just gonna go ahead and you know how I like going to different books, getting different history, specific stories. I wanted to start diving into the book I have here. I have many books I gotta get through, guys. So let me just go through them. We're gonna review this book for educational purposes, commentary, critique, fair use. All right. So I hope you guys enjoy it. This book is called Patriots and Indians Shaping Identity in 18th Century South Carolina by Jeff W. Dennis. All right. Shout out to the author. If you want to get the book, go ahead. PDF version will probably be on my Patreon soon. We go to chapter 1 of this book. It's called chapter 1, right? It says, Beyond the Mountains and Over the Sea, somewhere. It says, A Tour of Cultures with Thomas Sumter and Ostenaco, Beyond the Mountains and Over the Sea. God is the maker of white and red people. That's the hijack with crayon colors. And we are all his children. There is no difference between them and us. We are both alike. The blood flows in their veins as in ours, and we have mutually the same passions and desires. Ostenaco, Cherokee headman, all right, so-called Cherokee, but yeah, let's call him Cherokee, addressed to British Indian Superintendent John Stewart, October 20th, 1765. As in November 1761, Thomas Sumter, a young Virginia militia sergeant, joined Lieutenant Henry Timberlake on a mission to help restore peace with the Overhill Cherokees of eastern Tennessee. The Overhill Cherokees, okay, so we are talking about the so-called, eventually what became known as the Cherokees of the eastern Tennessee area. So Sumter and Timberlake lodged that winter with the Indians. The following spring, they accompanied a band of Cherokees to Williamsburg. There it was decided that 2 Virginians would sail for England with the Second Warrior, Ostenaco, and 2 other headmen, Kun Shote, Standing Turkey, and Woyi, the Pigeon. At London in the summer of 1762, the 5 men were wined and dined, beset by onlookers, and given an appearance at the court of St. James. That August, Sumter escorted the 3 Cherokees right back across the Atlantic, as Timberlake remained behind in England. All right, so they over here chilling with with these European and going to Europe, and I guess diplomatic reasons, right? So the party landed and stayed several weeks at Charlestown, South Carolina, before traveling back to the Overhill Cherokee villages, wintering for a second time. With the Cherokees, Sumter grabs the occasion to capture a French-Canadian agent, Baron de Jones. The Timberlake expedition gave Thomas Sumter a first-hand view of Native American life, probably unsurpassed by any other leading patriot of the Revolution. The exposure that he and Ostenaco were afforded to one another's culture, and especially to Imperial London, was quite extraordinary. These 2 leaders gained a direct view of many of the peoples and institutions located at the center, as well as near the periphery of the British Atlantic world. The adventure impacted upon how they understand their own and one another's people, and their relative place in the world. For Sumter, the experience brought the small measure of fame and fortune he needed to escape debt and obscurity in Virginia. Without his service in the Timberlake expedition, in all likelihood, there would have been no Gamecock of Revolutionary War fame, all right? Because this guy is called the Gamecock, Thomas Sumter. That's what he's famous for, So Thomas Sumter was born on July 14, 1734, at Pretty's Creek, about 12 miles northeast of Charlottesville, located deep within the Virginia Piedmont. The settlement at Pretty's appear to have embodied the rustic, rough and tumble type of social order found in much of the colonial backcountry. Here, adversaries often confronted one another violently through bold and decisive acts. Sumter adopted this warrior ethos early in life. He also developed a taste for blood sports, such as cockfighting and fox hunting. His family owned land and he received some formal education. Nonetheless, Sumter always remained a man of martial pride and self sufficiency. He had no patience with foolish or devious behavior. Even as an elderly person, Sumter gave a strong impression that he was a man not to be meddled with. Thomas Sumter enlisted in the Virginia militia in 1756, the year after General Edwards Braddock's defeat. Sumter was assigned to Colonel George Washington's command, which had been tasked with halting the incursions of enemy warriors upon the frontier. This provincial deterrent proved insufficient, however, and during the next several years, Washington requested and received hundreds of Cherokee and Catawba mercenaries, all right? Catawbas too, huh? Eastern Sioux. So, who are these Cherokees really? Like, what is their background? I would be very interested to know all of their backgrounds. They could be from other tribes like Catawba. They could be from the Algonquin tribes. They could be from Powhatan confederacies. Eastern. There could be Muskogee people. A lot of these so-called Cherokees. Some of them have Europeans already. Runaway so-called slaves that joined the family. A lot of things. The Confederacy, the Cherokee of Eastern Tennessee. But as you see, Catawba mercenaries as well, huh? Mercenaries. Sumter no doubt encountered Ostenaco at this time, as well as Atakulakula, the Cherokees' leading diplomat. During 1758, Sumter served under Colonel Williamsburg III in the Forbes campaign, which finally reduced Fort Duquesne and drove the French from the upper Ohio. Promoted to sergeant in 1760, Sumter joined other militias stationed along the Holston River at the outbreak of the Cherokee War. Neither Byrd nor his replacement, Colonel Adam Stephen, had much inclination to march against the Cherokees. Virginia troops remained in camp during the conflict. In the fall of 1761, Stephen helped negotiate a treaty between Virginia and the Cherokees. Upon the Indians' request, the colonel dispatched Lieutenant Henry Timberlake, along with interpreter John McCormick and Sergeant Thomas Sumter, to carry a copy of the treaty to the Overhill villages. On November 28, 1761, the three men left Fort Robinson at the Long Island on the Holston with about 10 days of provisions and 20 pounds worth of trade goods. And come to part 2, it says here, Ostenaco was a good deal older and more experienced than Timberlake or Sumter. Most likely he was born in the first decade of the 18th century at the Appalachian village of Hiawassee or Hawassi. So he was born in the 1710s, that's what they're saying. Early in life, Ostenaco established himself as a warrior. For his skill in battle, he was awarded the title of Utasite, meaning man killer. Eventually, he rose to the rank of second warrior in the nation. The English also knew him as Judd's friend, on account of him having saved that person's life. Ostenaco was a sincere friend to the English, friend of the English, Cherokee guy, right? And appreciated their trade goods. Officials in Charlestown and Williamsburg understood this. They often depended upon Ostenaco, all right? They depended on Ostenaco to help ameliorate relations between the Cherokees and the southern colonies. During 1751, for example, the Second Warrior played a lead role in negotiating an end to a trade embargo and restoring good relations with South Carolina. As Governor James Glenn remarked at the time, I think if he comes down as one of the headmen that I now send for, it will facilitate all matters. No Cherokee leader more actively supported the English, listen, during the 7 Years' War than Ostenaco. So who are they fighting in the 7 Years' War? Is it only Europeans or are they fighting other Indian tribes? So this leader is actively supporting the English during the 7 Years' War. No other Cherokee leader did more than Ostenaco. During 1755, he led 130 Cherokee warriors to Virginia to help counter incursions by northern Indians. See, they're fighting other Indians, like I said. He suggested and led in the Sandy Creek expedition against the French allied Shawnees. Who's these Shawnees? Are you talking about Tecumseh's people? Hold up. Are you talking about Tecumseh's people, huh? Hmm. In 1756, for the next several years, Ostenaco continued to lead Overhill warriors north against the enemies of Virginia. So, who's the enemies of Virginia? Any Indian that's enemies of the Virginian government. So, they're enemies. That's who this Ostenaco's helping fight. The Second Warrior always remained fiercely Cherokee, notwithstanding his friendship with the English. After the Carolina militia killed 22 headmen held at Fort Prince George early in 1760, it was Ostenaco who helped to plan and execute the revenge slaying of 24 soldiers that August. Retribution complete, the Second Warrior then set about restoring good relations with the English. Ostenaco returned to Virginia in 1761 and was present for the conclusion of the treaty at Fort Robinson. He warned Timberlake's party not to go by canoe up the Holston. The water was low at this time of the year, and enemy northern Indians were about. A land crossing would be much better way to cover the 140 miles to the Overhill villages. That was the route that he and a band of warriors were headed, and Ostenaco offered for Timberlake to join them. The lieutenant declined because he wished to secretively, scope out the Holston River. Besides, Timberlake recorded he avoided Indian guidance because of the little pleasure I could expect in such a company. Feeling rebuffed and perhaps somewhat amused, Ostenaco left the three Virginians to fend for themselves. It did not take Timberlake long to realize that he should have heeded the Second Warrior. As December began, the weather in Appalachia turned inclement and icy while the Holston was remarkably low. Typically, the three Virginians spent several hours each day in Portage, all the while they anxiously kept watch against the appearance of northern Indians. In his memoirs, Timberlake no doubt embellishes some of the dangers that small expeditions faced in reaching the Overhill villages. Even so, it seems that on several occasions the party nearly met with disaster. First, on December 6th, with provisions nearly exhausted and one of two available guns badly damaged, Sumter lost the remaining dependable gun in deep water while trying to down a bear. We are now in despair, Timberlake recalled. I even deliberated whether it was not better to throw ourselves overboard, as drowning at once seemed preferable to a lingering death. Only with great perseverance were they able to mend the remaining gun so that it would fire after 10 or 12 times snapping. The very next day, they were scaling a 50-foot embankment when the group's canoe suddenly slipped into the Holston and began downriver. Without hesitation, Sumter leaped into the frigid water and swam a furious quarter-mile to retrieve it. When he returned, everything on him was stiff, frozen. Thereafter, the Virginians took greater care. On December 11th, they heard gunfire, which they interpreted as a sign of enemy warriors. Timberlake awoke that night to sound of something stumbling about in the brush. McCormick heard it too. He was quite frightened and thought about heading for the canoe. Only Sumter immediately recognized the noise to be an animal. No warrior would have trounced around so carelessly. He went right back to sleep to the astonishment of his companions, leaving very early the next morning. The men tried to navigate a rapids that they should have portaged. At one point, Sumter broke his pole against a boulder and fell into the rushing water, narrowly missing being smashed himself. On December 13th, the three men paddled into Broad and then the Tennessee River, passing the site of present-day Knoxville. Not far from here, an elderly warrior known by the English as the slave catcher found them. The slave catcher's wife went ahead by land to prepare food and reception. A slave catcher, huh? Finally, on December 19, 1761, Timberlake, Sumter, and McCormick reached the first of the Overhill settlements, completing a 22-day course of continual fatigues, hardships, and anxieties. Our entertainment from these people was as good as the country could afford, Timberlake recalled gratefully. Included were roast, boiled, and fried meats of several kinds, and very good Indian bread. baked to as great perfection as in any European oven. At the village of Tomotli, the next day the Virginians were received in a very kind manner by Ostenaco, and they were provided lodging in his and other hospitable Cherokee homes. The second warrior made sure to inform Timberlake that his party had arrived safely overland a full 10 days earlier. After several days' rest, Timberlake and McCormick were taken by Ostenaco to the Overhill Peace village of Shota for the reading of the Fort Robinson Treaty. Sumter remained behind in Tomotli. At Shota, Timberlake was impressed with the size of the wood and earthen village meeting house, a small mountain at a little distance. It could shelter 500 people. The treaty was read, after which Ostenaco gave a talk on burying the bloody tomahawk deep in the ground, never to be raised again. Ostenaco concluded the meeting in accordance with the proper Cherokee protocol, passing around the calumet, the peace pipe, the calumet, the pipe, which Timberlake dared not even wipe the end of despite their paint and dirtiness. A feast followed. I cannot much commend their cookery, Timberlake complained, everything being greatly overdone. Besides, what contributed greatly to render this feast disgusting was eating without knives and forks, and being obliged to grope from dish to dish in the dark. Timberlake avoided the evening ceremonial dance and instead retired to the hot house. The heat and smoke produced within that small structure drove him out. However, leaving not much calculated for repose to any but Indians. The next day, Ostenaco escorted the lieutenant and McCormick to Setico, long associated with the anti-English sentiment. Setico had been the first Cherokee town to send out raiders during the recent hostilities, and the first to be targeted by a South Carolina trade embargo. French sympathies were strong here. 38 English captives would have been killed at Setico had not Ostenaco intervened during the recent warfare. Timberlake and McCormick halted outside the village as preparations for the arrival were being completed. They were relieved to see two large white banners flying from the meeting house. These signified peace. Red colors would have announced war. Entering the town, the two men were met by a dozen warriors, painted all over in a hideous manner. 6 of them held eagle tails in their hands, a sacred symbol of peace. These warriors danced to the accompaniment of drums taken from the capture of Fort Loudoun. More rituals followed, little understood by the Virginians, before they were led into Setico's dimly lit central meeting house. Here, 4 of the eagle-tail dancers gave an encore performance. Now they were painted milky white and shook small gourds. Of course, the peace ceremonies would not be completed without the smoking of the calumet, the peace pipe. Timberlake quickly became nauseated from puffing on the huge number of pipes. Presented me on every hand which I dared not to be declined. Such a plethora had not appeared at Tomotli or Chota. The former belligerents of Seticos required many additional offerings to be made towards peace. Dancing continued through the night. Finally, at about 7 o'clock the next morning, Timberlake was taken to a headman's home for refreshment. The lieutenant was served by a white woman, one of about 30 English captives living in the Overhill town. So-called white, or are they talking about status, complexion, or status? Think about that. Another woman Timberlake met was said to have married the very warrior who killed her husband. She married the guy who killed her husband, She subsequently chose to stay with him rather than to return to white society, so-called white society, but South Carolina is a free colored person town since the beginning. We've gone over this. After 3 days of nearly continuous activity on January 2nd, 1762, Ostenaco ushered Timberlake and McCormick back to Tumutli and Thomas Sumter. The three Virginians remained at the Overhill villages for the next 2 months, not departing for Fort Robinson until March 10th. Sumter, Timberlake, and McCormick would have the opportunity to see and learn about the Cherokees in a way that few among their English brethren ever did. And we go to part 3, and it says here, numbering near 10,000 people, the Cherokees were the most populous Indian nation on the borders of British America at the mid-18th century. The nation lived in more than 40 villages at this time, clustered into 4 groups by geography and organized by dialect and political relations. Nearest to South Carolina were the lower towns of the Piedmont. Prior to the Cherokee War, these villages were of considerable importance to the colonial economy. Perhaps 10% of South Carolina's free men engaged in the Indian trade. At its zenith, early in the century, of course, that's going to include black folks. If we're talking about free men, because South Carolina had a lot of free people of color, guys. I'm telling you. So they were what? Engaged in the Indian trade at its zenith early in the century. The western outpost of 96 appears to have been so named because early settlers believed the station was 96 miles from the lower town of Keowee, gateway to the Cherokee markets. That's where the money's at. The valley towns were located deeper within the Appalachians, with the middle settlements positioned to their north. It was here in the difficult terrain before Echo that the Cherokees attacked 2 invading British armies in 1760 and 1761. Further from Carolina, but most accessible to Virginia, as well as to French Louisiana, were the Overhill towns of eastern Tennessee. The Peace village of Chota held influence here and was home to the Cherokees' leading headman of the 1750s, Conecorte, or Old Hop. Timberlake, Sumter, and McCormick met a number of English-speaking people and viewed various articles of British manufacture during their visit to the Overhill villages. Still, the 3 men entered an essentially alien culture. The villagers' appearance, language, and behavior were unmistakably Native American, and the Virginians would have better grasped the forms than the meanings within Cherokee society. Timberlake's memoirs do not comment directly on Thomas Sumter's behavior among the Indians in 1761 to 62. Nevertheless, the fact that the following year Sumter volunteered to spend another winter in the Overhill towns, combined with surviving accounts from that visit, intimates that he must have felt reasonably at home among the Cherokees, okay? He was at home, Sumter, among the Cherokees. Timberlake's memoirs first were published in 1765. The work constituted the most substantial report then available upon the Cherokees' country, government, genius, and customs, and it was translated into French and German editions, complemented by Edmunds Atkins' report and plan, 1755, David Tate's journal, 1772, and James Adair's history, which we have read, right? He's talking about that they are the ancient Israelites, literally, in the whole book almost. And that's from 1775. And William Bartram's Travels, 1791. We've read, I think, all these books. Timberlake's memoirs remains a helpful resource for research upon southeastern village life during the colonial era. Buildings and other functional man-made objects were among the easiest features of Cherokee society for white visitors to comprehend. So-called white, Timberlake found the villagers' wattle and clay homes to be tolerably well built. Besides residences, most southeastern towns included a hothouse, granaries, a council house, a square ground. Cherokees were proficient in canoe construction, cannon, weaving, and metal work. Such products, as well as Indian pottery baskets and clay pipes, often were bartered and made their way into colonial households. The Cherokees are the most ingenious Indians, Edmund Atkins assessed. According to Adair, the nation produced beautiful stone pipes, and the handsomest clothes baskets I ever saw. With proper cultivation, they would shine in the higher spheres of life. Southeastern people's personal appearance further captivated English observers. Timberlake describes the Cherokees as being of a middle stature, of an olive color. All right, olive. You know, olives come in very dark tones, like including like black, so-called almost black, right? Olive color, huh? Though generally painted, and their skin stained with gunpowder, pricked into it, very pretty figures. So he's saying the southeastern peoples, but that's what I'm saying. They're not just talking about so-called Cherokees, right? Cherokees, they're including a lot of other people that might not even be Cherokees. He saw the villagers as highly exotic people who wore bubbles in their hair and rings in their noses, and who slid and stretched their ears to enormous size to hold more jewelry. Many now wore an aggregate of native and European fashions, okay? And European fashions, although the old people still remember and praise the ancient days. When they had built little dress, when they had but little dress, sorry. So Cherokee men usually shaved most of the head, while women's hair might reach all the way to the ground. Timberlake found these maidens remarkably well featured, and the presence of many villagers of mixed descent indicates that other so-called white visitors did too. About 9 months after the Virginian stay, in fact, Ostenaco's daughter bore a son, who was christened Richard Timberlake. It is not unlikely that fellow bachelor Thomas Sumter became intimate with one or more of the Cherokee women as well. So basically, Richard Timberlake, who probably became a chief or something, his mom is the Ostenaco's daughter. He was half, Timberlake's, that's Timberlake's offspring with Ostenaco's daughter. So, they are mixing with the natives. No area reveals the chasm between old and new world ways more clearly than that of gender relations. European men lorded it over their families, and society's wealth, power, and status were male prerogatives. In the Western early modern world, Cherokee society was very different. The matrilineal, okay? The matrilineal and matrilocal nature of their communities granted women an independence that confused and, as historian Tom Hadley explains, even threatened European males. Adair for one sneered at the nation as having a petticoat government. Cherokee women retained their property upon marriage and had the option of divorce. They were not ostracized for participating in premarital sex, nor punished harshly in most instances of adultery. In council, matrons known as warwomen and beloved women held considerable influence and often determined the fate of hostages. Women, moreover, participated in much of the Cherokee trade. During the siege of Fort London in 1760, women continued to barter foodstuffs with the English garrison, despite pleas and threats made by the lead warrior, Willie Nawa. They reportedly laughed at him. All right, that's what they did. Continuing, the clan was the most important social political linkage in native society. Who's your daddy? Would have appeared an irrelevant question to southeastern peoples. Clan membership followed the mother's lineage, and one of her brothers or uncles usually was entrusted with the training of a male child. 7 clans represented the Cherokee people, forming the sinews of village government and justice. They were identified with the totems of the wolf, deer, bird, panther, or jaguar, right? Wind, wild potato, and paint. Members of each clan generally could be found in any village. Visitors could expect to be provided lodging and hospitality at the home of king, even those they had never met before. It was the clan that would exact retribution in the event of a killing or other assault. The woman who laughed at Willie Nawa knew he would not harm them, for their relations would make his death atone for theirs. As did their mothers, Indian children enjoyed a degree of latitude that would have appeared scandalous to most European males. Serious misconduct could result in a dry scratching. Example, the creation of a scrape mark on dry skin, which might remain visible for several days. Such treatment was intended principally as means to shame Cherokee boys into better behavior. Southeastern parents nonetheless refrained from whippings or beatings. The Cherokee's first warrior, Okonostota, flatly rejected offers of English schooling for village children. Trying to control youth or break their will hardly was his idea of a progressive education. Timberlake mentions a number of young European prisoners held in the Overhill towns. It is recorded that they did not, did nothing but cry and would not eat. Upon their return to the rigors of colonial society several years later, Cherokee girls learned to tend crops, do craft work, and to ritually celebrate the life-giving blood of menstruation and childbirth. Cherokee boys, in contrast, had to hone their life-taking skills as hunters and warriors. To prove their courage, young men trained themselves to endure pain and hardship without complaint. They adopted stoic personas, spoke solemnly, and rarely smiled in public. Even the frenetically paced ball and chunky games, which had few rules and many injuries, might be played in silence, as long as London Observer would note of Ostenaco and his two fellow headmen. There seems to be a mixture of dignity and sternness in their countenances. Thomas Sumter could have made for a Cherokee warrior. In his rearing and temperament, he was well suited to appreciate certain facets of Cherokee gender behavior. To begin, it was his mother and not his father that played the largest role in Sumter's upbringing, all right? He always remembered her very affectionately, saying that it took a strong minded mother to produce a strong minded man. His father owned a small mill in which Sumter sometimes worked as a boy. He became restless of house confinement, however, and preferred to spend his time hunting, gaming, and engage in military service. Contemporaries describe Thomas Sumter as being a medium height, erect, broad shouldered, and tapering to his feet. He was an eager, fierce competitor. Even into his 70s, he played a strenuous ball game known as fives, often humbling opponents less than half his age. Sumter was in the prime of his life during the 2 winters he spent with the Cherokees. He later spoke of competing with them, and he may have joined in some of their dangerous ball games. As Sumter recalled, he was able to outrun all but one of his male village rivals. The future Gamecock early displayed the kind of reserve and toughness prized by the Cherokee warriors. He was not communicative. An acquaintance recalled, not haughty, just proud and dignified. No one questioned his personal courage. When Sumter was wounded terribly at the Battle of Blackstocks in 1780, he gravely refused to abandon his post. Sumter remained bleeding on the battlefield until he could no longer ride, stand, or even speak. Somehow the partisan warrior survived. Generosity was another important feature of Cherokee society that Thomas Sumter would have appreciated. Timberlake praised the Indians, particular method for relieving the poor, which I shall rank among the most laudable of their religious ceremonies. Bartram concurred, they are just honest, liberal, and hospitable. With those in need, even with strangers, many villagers always appeared ready to share whatever they had. Sumter also could be quite generous. The old I guess General had many poor people living and squatting on his lands to whom he was kind. Remembered one associate, he was good in giving medicine, and to them was ready to do favors when approached in the right way. Sumter might have found something to admire in village politics had he understood them. The Cherokees did not entertain any coercive, centralized authority, but relied upon local councils as forums for debate and consensus. Timberlake doubted the efficacy of any such system, which had neither laws or power to support it. Sumter, though, was a firm advocate for personal independence and local autonomy. As an officer during the Revolutionary War, he allowed his troops considerable latitude, just as he felt quite free himself to act independent of continental command. Following the Revolution, Sumter fought against ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Thereafter, he opposed strong central authority. During 2 decades of service in the U.S. House and Senate, even at the age of 96 in 1830, Sumter would lobby on behalf of John C. Calhoun's nullification doctrine. Native religion was a vital concern of village life that almost certainly outstripped the ken of Timberlake and his companions. Nearly all colonists, some Quakers excepted, labeled the Indians intricate rituals along a continuum that ran between nonsense at best to witchcraft at worst. Again, Dodge the hijack, that's their opinion, right? Timberlake enjoyed watching the dances. He downed the caffeine rich, purgative black drink. Had the coffee, chocolate, cacao. What is this black drink? Such festivities, nevertheless, were extremely superstitious, that and ignorance going always hand in hand. Writing a decade later, James Adair would offer more nuanced descriptions and more imaginative suppositions. So James Adair, he's talking about them being, biblical people. So that's why they're not even quoting James here. They're saying imaginative suppositions. That's a hijack right here. See, this author is like they're trying to make it look more like, I can tell by reading this chapter that it's trying to make something look really good, the settlers. Anyways, ostensibly, the forms employed in Native American religion revealed a hidden heritage. These people were descendants of the lost tribe of Israel. Okay, so that's exactly what he was calling imaginative suppositions. You see, James Adair, writing a decade later, yeah, we read the book. What was he saying about these so-called? It wasn't just the Cherokee, the Creeks, the Choctaw, because he married a Choctaw wife. He was amongst the Southeastern Indians. This is what I'm saying. In this book, guys, they're grouping a lot of different Indians as Cherokee. That's why we got to dodge the hijack with that a little bit. But as James Adair says, and they're quoting right here so you can see, right? These people were what? They were the descendants of the lost tribe of Israel, Yasharala, the real one, the ancient one. All right, 37, right? Footnote. James Adair, we read his book. He lived with them for 40 years, and he married a Choctaw princess. He had a Choctaw wife. He lived with them for 40 years. He noticed things. He was a Sephardic Jewish heritage, Irish Sephardic Jewish heritage, okay? And he knew when he saw somebody practicing biblical things that he read about in the Bible, right? When he saw the actual people actually living like that, they didn't have to tell him that, hey, we're the Israelites, because they ain't calling themselves Israelites or nothing like that. You know what I'm saying? But the words, right, their music, the traditions, the ceremonies, the way they live, everything, the way they honor the Great Spirit is just like the ancient Israelites. And that's why James Adair said these people were descendants of the lost tribe of Israel. Native American religion particularly informs believers of the need for humans to respect and acknowledge the sacred powers that sustain life, to maintain proper balance between the upper, middle, and lower worlds. Cherokees had to perform certain ceremonies. The Green Corn Festival, for instance, served to facilitate women's spiritual power as growers and nurturers. Okay? So, what do we know about the Green Corn Festival? They offer the first fruits, right? That's just like the feast that Israelites had. offering the first fruits, give it thanks to the Great Spirit. That's what it's literally all about. And as you can see, added woman's spiritual power as the growers and nurturers of the crops of the agriculture, right? Through careful supplication, the sun and other heavenly bodies were asked to confer their life-giving spirit upon the earth. That's the Haja, you see. He knows well that the Indians never said nothing about no sun. They were saying the Great Spirit. They said the Great Spirit. They never said nothing about no sun and heaven. They weren't worshiping. They gave thanks to the sun and they give thanks to the Great Spirit for the sun and the heavenly bodies. See, this is what I'm saying. We gotta dodge the hijack a little bit. We're gonna get through all these books though, and we pull out the babies, okay? I'm gonna just read them. This is why I've been holding off on reading a lot of these books, but I'll let you guys discern through the info as we read this, right? As for native men, their role as hunters and warriors required that they look in the opposite direction for help before they could set out to kill fellow creatures of the earth. All right? Face the east or the west. You see, that's all these traditions. They would need to prepare medicine bundles containing snakeskins or other paraphernalia of the life-taking underworld. Right? Medicine men, medicine pouches, right? Men especially were to avoid intercourse prior to the hunt or battle, for fear this would disable their deadly preparation with the animating essence of woman. Wow. So it's deeper than that, but it's not just like, oh, it's a bad thing. It was more for vigor, keep your vigor, keep you know, your mind on something else, like keep your strength. It says Henry Timberlake did not feel very secure in the Overhill towns in spite of the welcome and hospitality he received. All right, we're in part 4 now. During February 1762, rumors spread that some Cherokee people recently had been killed by Northern Indians with English assistance. If this was true, Timberlake worried he and his companions would be slaughtered in retribution. Fortunately, Ostenaco gave a soothing speech which was received with shouts of applause and counsel. Soon, new intelligence arrived that Cherokee survivors of an Iroquois attack, Iroquois attacking so-called Cherokees, I thought they were the same people. I thought the Tasanagi came from the Iroquois and joined and became part of the Cherokee, and I thought they were the same. But you see, Iroquois attacking as usual. That's what they did. Iroquois, they came down and took over a lot of tribes' land and war. They're very warlike. They were trying to rule as an empire. So Cherokee survivors of an Iroquois attack actually were receiving protection from the English, so-called English. The lieutenant was happy to bring this news to the villagers. Attention, and they seemed tolerably well satisfied. As additional insurance, Timberlake embellished his report and told the Overhill people that a Fort Robinson physician now was attending to a wounded Indian who must soon recover. But Timberlake remained concerned. I now began to be very desirous of returning and acquainted Ostenaco of my anxiety. The weeks passed. Still, Ostenaco did little to prepare for departure. Timberlake even threatened to leave without him. This, however, would have been my last resource. The lieutenant admits in his memoirs the previous season's experience had taught him better. The second warrior endured Timberlake's nagging, but he was not a man to be rushed. Ostenaco waited for warriors to return from the winter hunt. He waited for Atakulakula to report on the recent negotiations with South Carolina. He waited to celebrate Willie Nawa's successful raid against the Shawnees, Against the Shawnees, Tecumseh. Most importantly, Ostenaco waited because he had news of 8 more Cherokees being killed or captured by Northern Indians along the route to Fort Robinson. A piece of intelligence kept from Timberlake until the return march was well underway. So who are these Northern Indians they're talking about, right? Being killed, Accompanied by a large band of warriors, Ostenaco and the Timberlake party finally set out for Fort Robinson on March 10, 1762, pausing at Chota. The Second Warriors party was advised by headmen to behave well to inhabitants and to remind the English of their promises of friendship and trade. A cannonade followed. performed by two pieces taken from Fort Loudon and Ostenaco, bellowed out the war song, loud enough to be heard at miles' distance. Setting off again, the party now totaled about 165 Indians, including many women. All right, many what women? A party, right? They're going on the charts. We got some Amazonians, right? Some warrior women going with them, right? Timberlake suspected the scent of presence was what brought many of these people along. It took just 9 days for the caravan to reach Fort Robinson. Along the way, they met with some heavy rain, a mini stampede of woods buffalo, and unmistakable signs of nearby enemy Indians. With so many warriors at his disposal, Ostenaco used a combination of spiritual power and bravado to dissuade any would-be attackers. First, the second warrior held an impromptu eagle-tail dance. Next, he and several companions turned to the place where the enemy tracks had been discovered and let go the war whoop, several times extremely loud. Ostenaco's party reached the fort on March 19th. It was abandoned except for two civilians and half a ton of flour, whereas most of the colony's militia recently had been dismissed. After several days' rest, the party resumed march. They soon passed an empty camp with Colonel Byrd had designated as Fort Atacapula. Sorry, later they crossed paths with Captain Israel Christian. Captain Christian was bound with a large cargo of goods for Cherokee country. To Timberlake's relief, more than half of the Indians happily joined Christian and returned to the Overhill villages. The remaining force continued on to Fort Lewis, where they were joined by interpreter William Shorey. Concluding a month of travels, the second warrior and 70 other Cherokees accompanied Timberlake, Sumter, and Shorey into Williamsburg early in April 1762. Lieutenant Governor Francis Fauquier was not prepared to welcome such a throng, and he appeared tight-fisted in his gift giving. Timberlake noted with concern how the Cherokees seemed much displeased by the official's show of parsimony. To avoid ill will, he advanced pretty considerably out of my own pocket to content them. Most of the Cherokee party then agreed to leave for home. Ostenaco was no stranger to Williamsburg. The second warrior had visited often during the 7 Years' War. Pledging Cherokee warriors. Remember, they were helping them during the 7 Years' War. They were helping the English, the Cherokee. So he gave them a lot of Cherokee warriors service in exchange for English goods. For his leadership against the Shawnees in the Big Sandy expedition of 1756 against the Shawnees, the Tecumseh's people, dragging canoe, Ostenaco was awarded with a special parade through Williamsburg and Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie's personal coach. In return, the second warrior and his band entertained the populace with a 4-day exhibition of Cherokee dancing, ceremonies, and speeches. It would be interesting to know exactly what Ostenaco thought of the Virginia capital, as well as the tobacco and slaves culture that facilitated it. The architecture and elaborate furnishings of the governor's mansion and other public buildings intrigued him, no doubt, all right? Oh, so this building, it must be old world style, old world building, right? That he founded, that he inherited. He appreciated the brandy and fine foods, as well as the colorful, elegant clothing. Probably, too, he enjoyed watching the craftsmen and touring the marketplace. Nevertheless, as occurred when the Virginians had visited the Overhill towns, the second warrior may have felt confused or dismayed by much of what was an essentially alien culture. Half of the people that Ostenaco might have seen would have been black slaves, so-called black slaves, Negro slaves. Remember, that does not mean African, and that does not mean that the person saying this is not so-called black himself. That's why we gotta dodge the hijack. We have so much context behind us already, a lot of years of research, right? Continues, says that many of the Europeans were indentured. Many of the Europeans were slaves or impoverished as well. As well what? As well as slaves, like he's saying black slaves. So he's comparing the Europeans, right? So-called whites. They were impoverished as well. Just like the black slaves. Remember, white, so-called white doesn't mean complexion either, guys. We've broken this down so many times, especially in the 1700s. Gotta pay attention to the time period. There's black Europeans and so-called black Indians. All melanated folks here. A lot of them going through the same thing, right? Impoverished as well, as it says here. Indentured servitude. These so-called black slaves, a lot of them were indentured as well. That's the context they leave it out. So anyways, continuing, says, suffering was present here, even amid plenty, by all peoples, right? Discipline was harsh. Children rarely were indulged, and women were entirely absent from council. Oh man. Ostenaco especially could have thought the Europeans' people's religion bizarre. Shortly before the time came for the Cherokees to depart, Ostenaco was invited to dine at the college of William and Mary. Come dine with us, our friend. At the William and Mary. Remember, they're doing raids against other Indians at this time. Same people that's inviting him. After the meal, a professor provided him and Timberlake with a tour of the facilities. Ostenaco viewed a portrait of the young George III, It must have been a swarthy man he saw. He remarked how he had long wished to see the king, my father. This is his resemblance, but I am determined to see himself, right? The governor tried to dissuade him, but Ostenaco was adamant. He had been more than 30 years since a young Atakulakula and 6 other Cherokees had journeyed to England. And that was to meet a different King George. I am now near the sea, the second warrior insisted, and never will depart from it till I have obtained my desires. Finally, Fauquier caved in. Ostenaco could go, along with 2 other headmen, known to the English as Standing Turkey, Hunschote, and the Pigeon, Wudgie. Henry Timberlake, Thomas Sumter, and interpreter William Shorey would accompany them, all right? As arrangements were made for the 3 headmen's departure, the remaining Cherokees prepared to return home. To them, the second warrior delivered a farewell address. William and Mary's student, Thomas Jefferson, ventured down to the Cherokee camp to hear this speech. Jefferson already was familiar with the great Otaheite as an occasional guest of my father. Under a full moon, Jefferson now listened to Ostenaco's sounding voice, distinct articulation, animated action. Years later, he remembered how the experience filled me with awe and veneration, although I did not understand a word he uttered. On May 15, 1762, the 3 Cherokees and the 3 Virginians boarded Captain Peter Blake's 16-gun frigate, Le Épreuve. The crossing took 1 month, and the passengers generally were favored with excellent weather. All right, so listen, now he's taking all these, got Ostenaco and all of them going to England now. They're gonna go. He always wanted to go to England. Now he got his wish, and they got on this ship here in 1762. They took a month to get over there. Even so, Timberlake and the Cherokees were seasick all the way. William Shorey fared the worst, dying of consumption en route. Wow, Shorey died. Until they returned to America, the Indians would be able to use little more than sign language for communication. Wow. And we go on to part 5. It says 18th century London, so we're talking about the 1700s, right? Constituted a unique phenomenon. At the time of the Timberlake expedition, nearly 1 million people resided in the early modern metropolis. a population well more than half of that of the 13 colonies combined. Signs of the city's burgeoning industrial commercial growth were everywhere: shipyards, breweries, textile plants, glass fronted retail shops, townhouses, and public squares, professional societies, theaters, museums, and exhibits. Here too was the imperial government in all of its splendor. There was nothing like London in America. Well, that's the hijack. And with the possible exception of Paris, there was nothing like it in Europe either. So we talking about, like, guys, come on, man, like Tenochtitlan was a whole empire city, beautiful temples, everything, just like they were talking about here, theaters, museums. So what they talking about? There was nothing like that in America. And there's a lot of places, all these buildings in the Americas, they're older than they're telling us. The Indians had these buildings. We're not gonna, that's what's gonna come out. The truth is gonna come out. We're gonna eventually be able to prove this. Anyways, it says the London elite conspicuously showcased great wealth. Skilled artisans, merchants, who's the merchants, and professionals also were able to purchase many luxuries. Most of the city's population, however, could not afford the elegance and excitement. Unskilled and poor, these people lived on the edge of subsistence in conditions that would have made a modern slum seem like paradise. Their neighborhoods were overcrowded, filthy, and dangerous. You guys hear that? They had real hoods back in England in the 1700s, like crazy, grimy, like grimier than modern slums. Listen to what they're saying. How could it get grimier than modern slums? Wow. Alcoholism, gambling, and crimes against people and property were everyday events in 18th century London. It was bad, man. And the parlor of coal smoke hung thick over all. British officials prepared carefully for the Cherokees' arrival, for Ostenaco was a powerful monarch. The St. James Chronicle insisted, capable of raising 10,000 men upon any emergency. The Le Prouve dropped anchor at Plymouth on June 16, 1762, and that's Plymouth over there in England, guys. While being rowed to shore, the Americans viewed a mighty 74-gun man of war. Inspired, the Second Warrior launched into a ceremonial song with great gusto. Painted in a very frightful manner, his loud alien lyric drew such a crowd of spectators that the party had a difficult time landing and making their way to an end. He drew so much attention. Journeying on to London, the Cherokees and their escorts were introduced to the Earl of Egremont, Charles Wyndham, British Secretary of State for the Southern Department. Lord Egremont made sure his visitors were nicely attired and provided with comfortable accommodations. The group made its first public appearance at Kensington Gardens on June 23rd. All dressed in English fashions, Ostenaco and his fellow warriors became instant celebrities. Their escorts, Timberlake and Sumter, wore elegant red uniforms. During the next several weeks, the small group visited such majestic sites as Westminster Abbey, the Tower, and St. Paul's Cathedral. They were wined and dined by aristocrats, met the poet Oliver Goldsmith, and the Indians had their portraits done by Joshua Reynolds. The Cherokees' preference, though, was for less sophisticated pleasures. So I wonder where these portraits are by Joshua Reynolds, huh? The original ones, huh? They were fascinated by the pantomime and stage sets at Sadler's Wells. The rotunda at Ranelagh Gardens reminded them of the large civic centers at home. Vauxhall Gardens was their favorite destination. Here they drank sweet wines and were greatly pleased with the entertainment. You see, they're getting wined and dined for sure. These so-called Cherokee Indians over there, friendly Indians of the English. There's a lot of things going on at the same time in the Americas. A lot of Indians at war with English. So again, shaking the hands with some hundreds of the gentlemen who crowded to see them. Crowds turned out everywhere. The Cherokees and their escorts went. The Americans quickly learned to be shy of company, not ever having experienced such sensory overload. London must have seemed incredibly noisy, crowded, and impersonal to them, all right? So picture them over there in the 1700s, they're a whole different world, right? The Virginians found it difficult to follow the thick accent, rapid fire delivery, and urban slang indigenous to the metropolis. Urban slang indigenous. Remembered as a rather reclusive man with simple taste, Thomas Sumter may well have felt more comfortable with life in the Overhill villages than here. The strain soon began to show on the Americans. According to Lloyd's London Evening Post, not less than 10,000 persons turned out to see the Indians during a return visit to Vauxhall Gardens. Removing into the orchestra, the Cherokees entertained themselves and the gaping multitude by sounding the strings of a violin, clapping their hands in return for the claps of applause bestowed upon them, and swallowing by wholesale bumpers of Frontenac. Inebriated, it was not until well past midnight that their Cherokees began to think of departing. Making his way to a waiting coach, Ostenaco collided with a gentleman who had pressed too close. A sort of scuffle mistakenly ensued, and the man pulled out his sword to intimidate the Cherokee. You guys hear that? Somebody bumped him, and the Cherokee dude, Ostenaco, was like, "Yo, hold up, man. What's wrong? What's your problem, man?" And the dude pulled out his sword. You know, nowadays they might pull out a gun. He pulled out his sword on the Cherokee Indian, huh? Remember, Indians are warriors. They're coming from a lot of crazy stuff in the Americas. So picture this scene. It's crazy, right? So he pulls out the sword, right, to intimidate Ostenaco. The second warrior grabbed it and snapped it in two, cutting his own hands pretty badly in the process. Wow, that sounds like a movie. You really saying that this really happened, or they adding drama? Supposedly he grabbed the sword and broke it in two. That sounds crazy. Cut his hands and everything, right? Pretty badly. Angry and weary, he then parked himself on the ground and refused to budge. Timberlake and Sumter finally lifted and placed Ostenaco on the floor of the coach. Thus ended this wretched scene of British curiosity and savage debauchery, opined the London press. Thomas Sumter similarly took matters to hand when he accompanied a genteel acquaintance on a visit to the Cherokee's residence. A domestic halted the two men and demanded that they pay an admission fee. The insulted Sumter took a warrior's satisfaction and knocked him down. Upon hearing what happened, Timberlake defended his companion. "A blunt Virginia soldier," he wrote, "need not take an insult from so mean a quarter." The young man who had faced all dangers for the service of his country in the war, who had been so highly instrumental in saving us from the dangers that threatened us in going to their country, and had accompanied us ever since, received that affront from an insolent servant. The following day, the servant's kinsman came before Timberlake, threatening to have Sumter arrested. This man's language was so scurrilous, reported Timberlake, that I was perfectly at a loss how to retort it adequately. He ended up giving the man a tongue lashing and let him know that he would not hesitate to physically assault him as well. There's a lot of beefy stuff going on here. It's crazy, man. The man backed down, although he quietly got revenge through his control of the townhouse menu. For the remainder of their stay, the Americans received the worst available cuisine on Suffolk Street. Oxshick, cowheel, and such like dainties, only the choicest parts of the beast. On July 8, 1762, the Cherokees and their Virginian escorts were admitted to the court of St. James. Ostenaco was dressed in a blue mantle covered with lace, and his head richly ornamented, while upon his neck hung a silver gorget with his Majesty's arms engraved. Hoon's Shoti and Woji comparably were clad, but in scarlet. So yeah, they're dressing them right. For an hour and a half, the three Cherokees and the young English king tried to form a connection across their radically different worlds. The Virginians were so confused in their efforts to translate, however, that the king could ask but few questions. For his part, Ostenaco began to offer George III his salivated pipe and an arm-wrenching diplomatic handshake. The Virginians prevented this major foxpox just in time. Despite the gap in language and etiquette, Ostenaco must have been pleased by his audience with the king. Just the fact he had met with George III would add substantially to the Second Warrior's reputation and authority in council. In the Overhill towns, he now could play a trump card that almost no other Cherokee could. I have been with the great king. Furthermore, Ostenaco might attribute to the monarch virtually any detail of communication he wanted. Nobody would refute him. How many people in the Cherokee villages could have any idea what the king really said? Following is an example from a talk Ostenaco delivered in June 1771. He told me our land was like his. The one was his and the other was ours. He told me that white and red people should live like brothers, and all his talks are good. He said the land he lived upon was his own, and he could do what he pleased with it, that there should be a line drawn to separate our land, and we might do as we please with ours. It appears uncertain whether George III's 1762 message to Ostenaco included discussion of boundary lines. Not until 1763 did Lord Egremont present plans for such a reserve. Perhaps it is more likely that in 1771, the Second Warrior was with Southern Indian Superintendent John Stewart's encouragement, putting such words into His Majesty's mouth because all his talks are good. Ostenaco long had competed with Oconostota and Ataculacula for influence in the Cherokee nation. That was no secret. Timberlake knew it. Colonial and imperial officials knew it. Even the London press knew it. For decades, Ostenaco had proven himself a formidable leader in a battle and a capable diplomat. Yet he had remained as only the Second Warrior. Previously, he could not match the prestige surrounding Ataculacula's celebrated visit to London in 1730. Now Ostenaco had replicated the feat. In fact, he had done one better. George II was dead, and it was Ostenaco and not Ataculacula who was the Cherokee's living link to George III. South Carolina Governor Thomas Boone would note upon the Second Warrior's return to America. The headman apparently aims at influence with his nation. This seems his chief and almost his only concern. Preparing for departure, the Americans were informed that they would be sailing for Charlestown rather than Virginia. One reason the ministry insisted upon this destination was to assure South Carolina that it was not being overlooked in the reconciliation with the Cherokees. None of the Cherokee headmen were pleased with the announcement, all right? That's Catawba land, that's Eastern Siouan, that's Algonquin, that's not Cherokee land. They don't want to go there. They weren't pleased with the announcement. Lord Egremont then instructed Timberlake to deceive the Cherokees to get them on board, only to find that the lieutenant himself would not go to Carolina. Sumter hesitated as well. Timberlake knew, though, that the Cherokees would be disoriented and distressed without either of them, and so finally persuaded Sumter to undertake the escort alone, back across the Atlantic. The young man was to receive 150 pounds for his service, or for this service, Timberlake did not return to America until 1763. Thereupon, he accompanied another group of Cherokees to England. Man, these Cherokees going over there, huh? The novelty of such visitors having worn off, Timberlake's second party received little fanfare or ministerial support. Shortly before his death in 1765, Timberlake wrote, "When I will satisfy my creditors, I must retire to the Cherokee or some other hospitable country, where unobserved I and my wife may breathe upon the little that yet remains." Perhaps he said this to try to shame the ministry into greater generosity. Perhaps he really meant it. In any event, Timberlake grieved the departure of Sumter, and the Cherokees left him without money or friends. So now we're going to go into part 6 of this book. It says here, Thomas Sumter had been in the company of the Cherokees since the close of 1761. He had become friends with Ostenaco, Shote, and Wyoji. The four men set forth from London for Portsmouth on August 20th, 1762. Near the harbor of Southampton, they visited a brig for French prisoners, which the Indians viewed with uncommon curiosity. Sumter and the Cherokees were treated to a 2-hour parade and firing exhibition the following morning by the Wiltshire militia. Arriving at Portsmouth, they were provided with a tour of its fortifications, ships, and dockyard. Evidently, these efforts worked to drive home the military and commercial prowess of Britain upon the Cherokees. Noted the London press. Their general observation on being shown these great objects is that their English brethren can do everything. On August 24th, Sumter's party boarded to begin the long voyage back to America. So they're going back and forth, right? It says once again it was Peter Blake's L'Épreuve that carried them. Lord Egremont took pains to remind the captain and Sumter to treat the Cherokees with their finest hospitality. Sumter was entrusted with a letter for South Carolina Governor Thomas Boone, whom Egremont further urged to remove all ill impressions. The seas proved rough during the westbound passage. See, I told you, it's a lot harder coming back, guys. You see how they had a good weather and good winds and everything, very favorable. They got there in a month, going over there from America. On the way back, they're having turbulence, right? They're having turbulence. Rough westbound passage. Along the way, L'Épreuve, the ship, right, came upon a small New England schooner smuggling goods from the French Caribbean. Eager for any appearance of action, the Indians were led to believe she was a Frenchman. They got out their muskets and cartouche boxes and seemed pleased. The Cherokees were allotted some coconuts, tobacco, and gunpowder from the vessel's confiscated cargo. You see, so any schooners traveling with so-called Africans like the Clotilda, right? They would have got stopped on the way, guys. You can't be doing that, especially when slavery was already illegal since 1808. And we're talking about that happened in the 1860s. Yeah. Anyways, on October 28th, 1762, Sumter and the Cherokee headmen disembarked at Charlestown, where they remained for several weeks. This was the Virginians' first visit, although Ostenaco had been to the city many times before. Perhaps he even helped show Sumter around town. The South Carolina Low Country differed in appearance from any of the places that Sumter and the Cherokees had looked upon during the past 10 months. The region's subtropical climate, dense slave population, and tax labor system better resembled the British Caribbean than the Chesapeake. Low Country Europeans averaged 4 times greater wealth than the Chesapeake planters. Large-scale cultivation of rice and indigo brought great lucre into Charlestown. For the affluent, no American city was more lavish, entertaining, or genteel than the South Carolina capital. Now, guys, I want to emphasize Charlestown was a free people of color city, guys, especially during this time. You can literally investigate it. I've shown the sources, I've shown the history, I've shown the genealogy as to why I'm telling you this. There's a lot of books talking about free people of color of Charleston, very prominent people, guys. All right. During this time, especially. So, very lavish, entertaining, and people of South Carolina, right? The capital. It says, despite its opulence, Charlestown had not been on Ostenaco's list of choices for either departure from America or return from England. The second warrior went so far as to inform Governor Boone that had he been refused to sail from Virginia, he probably would have gone next to New York to ask permission. Ostenaco held little faith in the goodwill of South Carolina. He could not forget his friends and associates slain by militia at Fort Prince George 3 years earlier, right? Slain by who? His enemies, probably other Europeans with other Indians that are fighting the Cherokee. That's why I told you it's not their territory. South Carolina is not Cherokee territory, really, guys. So, even at London, when the three Cherokees observed a roomful of grenadiers fixed bayonets for drill, they had become very much agitated, having a suspicion of treachery. Ostenaco, Kunshote, and Owoji met with the governor on November 3rd, 1762. Finally able to communicate again through an interpreter, Ostenaco told Boone how they had met with a good deal of trouble in going over the wide water. This, however, was more than recompensed by the satisfaction I have had in seeking the king. The second warrior particularly commended Thomas Sumter. That gentleman has treated us exceeding well and has been very good to us. As Boone later reported to Lord Egremont, Ostenaco was extremely urgent that his English companion should attend him to his own country. Mr. Sumter consented with readiness, and Otacite was gratified. Otacite. 1 week later, Sumter and three headmen began the 250-mile trek to Kiowa and the borders of Cherokee settlement. Resting at 96, they were greeted by Kitengunsta, the Prince of Chota, who was eager to hear about the overseas adventure and meeting with the king. The Prince of Chota. The party resumed its march on November 18th, next stopping at Fort Prince George in Kiowa. Here too Ostenaco delivered his story. The men crossed the mountains around the opening of December and entered the Overhill settlements. They're finally in Tennessee now. From his home at Tomotali, Ostenaco now prepared his most triumphant presentation of all. Okonostota and other headmen being absent on the winter hunt, the second warrior sent word for them to return instantly for his talk. He's like, hey, I need these guys here, right? I'm about to brag. I'm about to show them I'm the man now. The first warrior did not come, however, and after 3 days of waiting, Ostenaco and Sumter went to him instead. Okonostota and his retinue finally heard the full narrative of the second warrior's great odyssey. Ostenaco further promised that he would journey back shortly to Kiowa and return to Overhill towns with many presents sent from England. Before departing for the lower towns, Ostenaco requested that Okonostota detain 4 French visitors present in the nation. The great warrior agreed, and Ostenaco headed east while Sumter retired to Tomotli. Sumter soon learned, though, that Okonostota actually was planning to accompany the Frenchmen back to Alabama. The young Virginian sought to dissuade the great warrior and was rebuffed. Sumter then hid the party's horses and delivered Okonostota a second, more pointed lecture. That also accomplished nothing, as the great warrior and his French companions disappeared overnight. He didn't care about Ostenaco's travel to England or something, what they had to say. Remember, he is like a rival chief here, right? Warrior, so-called warrior. So Ostenaco heard Sumter's story upon returning from Kiowa. The great warrior was a rogue. The second warrior commiserated, who maintained a perverse love for the French. Oconostota visited Mobile as well as New Orleans during the winter of 1762 and 63. He never became as enamored with the British as Jude's friend, and he certainly was not going to start taking orders from either him or a 28-year-old militia sergeant. Even if French Canada had been crushed during the Seven Years' War, the lower Mississippi Valley largely had been insulated from English attack. France recently had agreed to remove from the region in secret negotiations conducted at Fontainebleau. But Oconostota did not know this, and neither did the Louisiana agents who continued to ply the Cherokees for support. A French Canadian officer, the Baron de Jones, appeared at the Overhill towns in January 1763. He was a no-nonsense veteran of the Seven Years' War, as well as a gifted linguist who was said to have mastered 7 native dialects. De Jones told the Cherokees that the French had got the better of the English everywhere and would soon be masters of all of America. Oconostota being absent, village headmen granted Sumter permission to seize the Frenchman, but only if he accomplished it on his own. Sumter found De Jones at the village of Tocquois. He bluntly told the man that he must submit to surrender or risk death. The officer replied that he was not afraid to die, and a struggle ensued. Cherokee villagers watched this bizarre microcosm of the imperial conflict with great interest. The brawl continued for some time before Sumter finally got the upper hand. With great difficulty and hardship, he transported and eventually delivered De Jones to the commanding officer at Fort Prince George, all right? So it's funny, this Sumter and these Indians, they like to get into squalls, into brawls, man. They don't play, all right? Got to give that to Sumter. He don't play. Thomas Sumter bid the Cherokees farewell early in March 1763 and returned to South Carolina. His single-handed capture of an enemy agent won acclaim in the South Carolina Gazette. On March 21st, he appeared before the council and delivered a detailed account of his accomplishments at the Overhill villages. Governor Boone was highly pleased and sent a glowing report to London, asking Lord Egremont to compensate Sumter generously for his expenses, time, fatigue, and risk. Shortly thereafter, the young sergeant from Petty's Creek departed for his home in Virginia. And now we're going to go to, I think we already had said part 6. I think it's supposed to be part 7, but anyways. It says, nothing they experienced before or since would surpass Ostenaco's and Thomas Sumter's extraordinary travels together during the Timberlake expedition. In little more than a year, they had experienced the Overhill towns and Cherokee homelands, Williamsburg and the Chesapeake, London and the Court of St. James, Charlestown and the Low Country, and 2 transatlantic crossings. That was a lot of work they did. All this they did together, and the 2 men's lives were changed. Ostenaco would not supplant Oconostota as the Cherokee's first warrior, or Ataku Lakula as his nation's highest esteemed diplomat, all right? So all that work he did with Sumter and the Europeans, it didn't help him at all in the eyes of the Cherokees, when it comes to his status. Already in his 50s by the time of the expedition, he would remain as the second warrior in the Overhill towns and as Jude's friend to the English. Nonetheless, the journey overseas brought Ostenaco lasting fame on both sides of the Atlantic. He knew the English in a way that nearly no other Cherokee did, and for the remainder of his life he cherished his metal strongbox and its paraphernalia given to him by the king. No headman more actively collaborated with the English during the final colonial years than Ostenaco. During 1764, he led an attack against Pontiac's Confederates. Pontiac's, right? The warrior, right? So he's fighting the Shawnees and he's fighting Pontiac, huh? For which the Cherokees were given 900 pounds in reward for fighting the enemies of the settlers. Subsequently, the Second Warrior and his good friend Kitegunsta served as two leading Cherokees who helped Superintendent John Stewart run boundary lines. Now he's helping him create boundaries. Still, Ostenaco never became a sycophant to the English or anyone else. He consistently acted upon what he believed was in his people's best interest. To Stewart's dismay, during 1770 to 71, the Second Warriors backed the Treaty of Lochaber. This Cherokee cession canceled the nation's trade debts in exchange for lands actually held by the Creeks. In exchange for lands held by the Creeks. You guys hearing this? I want you to pay attention. So he said, nah, they canceled their debt, right, with the English that they had in return for lands that the Creeks owned. That's what I'm trying to tell you guys. A lot of these so-called Cherokee lands were not theirs. They were, again, more over to the eastern Tennessee area. That was their stronghold. And nowhere else, really. So-called Creeks, right? Because a lot of those people are other Indians and Black Europeans, who are mixing and become a confederacy and all that. So they're exchanging lands that is not. So the English are giving the Cherokees lands that is not even theirs, right? They're taking Creeks lands. During 1775, Ostenaco rejected the long-term lease of real Cherokee territory by Atakulakula and Okonostota at Sycamore Shoals. He later removed such south and west from the Overhill villages to join with Chickamauga secessionists, okay? Listen, what? They're taking the Chickamauga secessionists. They want to become part of the Cherokee Nation? Huh. Ostenaco certainly shared these militant hunter-warrior ethos, yet his life experience prevented him from embracing the separate races. All right, separate races believed central to nativist teachings. As he preached to fellow headsmen and warriors in 1765, God is the maker of white and red people, right? He means all people, and we are all his children. There is no difference between them and us. We are both alike. The blood flows in their veins as in ours, and we have mutually the same passions and desires. Ostenaco lived out the final years with his grandson, Richard Timberlake. Richard Timberlake. I wonder if the famous guy, the singer today, guys, Timberlake, is related, descends from these people. That way he look a little Asian. Is this Ostenaco's descendant? That would be interesting to find out, right? You guys want me to try it out, the genealogy? Maybe I will. So he ended up living with his grandson, who now is, mixed with European blood, Richard Timberlake. Remember, he died around 1780, sometime late in his 8th decade of life. The old warrior's passing happened just about the time that his former travel partner, Thomas Sumter, won fame as the South Carolina Gamecock. Not long after returning to Virginia, Sumter was sued by two men for debts he long had failed to repay. Arrested in November 1763 and placed in a Staunton jail, Sumter escaped with the help of a friend, Joseph Martin. Huh? Is that a Huguenot, Martin? Huh? A tomahawk and 10 guineas. A tomahawk, what does that mean? And 10 guineas, what does guineas mean? Are they trying to say, like, black folks? Are they trying to say Negroes? They're trying to say Africans? Or they actually mean animals, 10 guineas? Come on now, no primary source is talking about no guineas. So it says, his whereabouts over the next several months are unclear. Sumter was back in South Carolina by spring 1764. There he received a hefty 700-pound payment from the Earl of Egremont for his services with the Cherokees during the fall and winter of 1762 to 63. Sumter used that small fortune to build a store, tavern, and mill at Utah, about 60 miles equidistant from Charlestown, Camden, and the Congarees. His business performed well and likely included commerce with the Catawba Indians, Eastern Siouans, Sumter's largest step to fortune came in 1767 when he married an older widow with assets totaling nearly 10,000 pounds. All right. He found a sugar mama. He found a sugar mama. Thomas Sumter's experiences with the Cherokee headmen and nation provided him with the measure of wealth and reputation essential for beginning anew in South Carolina. Had he not been a member of the Timberlake expedition, in all likelihood, no one today would know who Sumter was. All right, you guys hear that? That's why it's important, to do this little video. We get a little inside story behind this historical person. Sumter himself recognized the impact of the expedition upon the course of his life. As one acquaintance remembered, he always spoke of that trip to England in 1762 as gratifying to him, as it did for Ostenaco. The time that Sumter spent with his companions beyond the mountains and over the sea, somewhere, you see, and over the sea, beyond the mountains and over the sea, provided him with an exceptional view of many of the peoples and places within the British Atlantic world. When the American Revolution came, many South Carolina Whigs seemed pleased to condemn Indians, but not Thomas Sumter. His experiences with Ostenaco and the Overhill towns helped buffer him from identifying his patriotism with such xenophobic zeal. Did the two friends ever see each other again? There seems to be no evidence that they did. As commander of a rifle regiment in 1776, Sumter was dispatched from Charlestown to accompany one of 5 patriot armies sent that year against the Cherokees. Against the Cherokees, against his friends? Uh-oh. Sumter's expedition, however, did not reach across the Appalachians into the Overhill towns. Concluding the war, Ostenaco was one of the headmen who signed the 1777 Treaty of DeWitt's Corner. He's signing treaties, at which Sumter was not present. For many years after the Revolution, Sumter allowed Indians free residence upon his properties and welcomed Catawba veterans into his home. Catawbas, The ancient warrior lived to be nearly 98. Wow. Right up to the end of his vigor was amazing. Sumter rode 11 miles on horseback the very day before he died in June 1832. His mind and memory also remained sound. Perhaps sometime shortly before his passing, Thomas Sumter thought once again about the long-departed Ostenaco, Henry Timberlake, and boy-faced kin whom he had known some 70 years before. All right, and that's the end of this chapter, this little brief history on these individuals, Sumter, Timberlake, Ostenaco, and the other Indians and the other Europeans, right? A little inside story, okay? I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. We're going to definitely get into other chapters of this book. It gets pretty interesting, all right? So that's why I just want to do an introduction reading. There's a lot of books I'm going to start reading, guys, like a lot. So we're going to go chapter by chapter, and then eventually we have a whole better vision and context, perspective of inside stories going on in different regions and colonial times, so we can have all the context, right, to make our decisions about history. Again, this book was Patriots and Indians, Shaping Identity in 18th Century South Carolina by Jeff W. Dennis. All right, hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for tuning in, sticking around all the way to the end of the reading today. Appreciate you guys making the time to do that. You have a great rest of your day. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.